Welcome
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have Aiden Moore here for the Practical Young. Today he's going to be talking about Carl Jung's idea of individuation. Take it away, Aiden.
Awesome. So thank you all for being here and for your patience. Someone put in the chat that Mercury might be in retrograde, which it's very possible. That's the kind of morning I'm having. So I really appreciate your patience. It's a wonderful topic. There's going to be, the challenge for me and the technology side is pronounced right now. Originally, I was going to play some videos, which I'm not able to play. So I have some screenshots, and I'll be telling you the story as we go, and we're all in it together. So it's going to be more spontaneous than I had hoped, but I'm very excited to talk about this topic, which is this film. I'm going to switch to, I'll just share my whole desktop. I'm just going to try to avoid that, but I think this might be the way to go. And today we're going to be talking about this film, My Octopus Teacher. Okay, so I'll go into, well, I'm just going to show it like this. Apologies for not having it look better. But basically, when I saw this film, what I realized as a Jungian, right, is that there's a sort of subtext underneath this narrative. And we'll get into the narrative and we'll get into the subtext. But what I love about this movie is that we have very abstract examples of individuation when we read Jung's texts or when we read literature, right? Psychoanalytic literature, analytical psychology literature, and Jung's writings himself. He talks about individuation. And he describes individuation as his form of self-realization. So that's kind of what we're talking about in this film, is a process of self-realization. And what excited me so much about this film is, again, many of the examples I've read in his literature are a bit abstract, they're a bit intellectual, not always relatable, but in this film you see it happening in real time and in a way that just makes it so clear. It's a living example of this idea of self-realization, and in the Jungian framework we call this individuation. So what we're going to talk about, and it's going to be kind of many different themes that we'll weave in and out, but it'll be fun to take questions at the end if any of this stuff is of particular interest to any of you. So we'll get to questions about this stuff at the end. But thematically, we're talking about the film itself as an example of individuation. We're talking about individuation, which is Carl Jung's term for self-realization. We're talking about a midlife crisis. This guy, Craig Foster, and we'll get into the narrative, but he has kind of a breakdown in the middle of his life and goes into the ocean and becomes friends with an octopus, which if you haven't seen it, this will still make sense, but I do recommend seeing it because it's just an incredible film and the visuals are stunning. So, but it's sort of about his midlife crisis in a way. We'll talk a little bit about typology and how that relates to all the above. We'll talk about the spiritual experience, which is what this kind of is, and the relationship between inner and outer. In this case, it's Craig's inner world and his relationship with his family and also with this octopus and the ocean. So there's an inner and outer corollary. And we'll talk about the relationship between conscious and unconscious, right? And all of this has to do with this idea of self-realization. So this might seem a little overwhelming, but these are all undercurrent themes that we can touch on at the end if any of them jumps out at you. And we'll get into the actual story here. Craig Foster is a filmmaker. Because of the technology, I may have to jump between my notes and the visuals, which is very unfortunate. But basically, he's a filmmaker, and this film is about his midlife crisis that leads to a spiritual experience, okay? And I'm going to be talking about it from the framework of Jungian psychology. In fact, what I think I'm going to do is export this so I can have both open at the same time. My switching modes here from the movie into the stills, which is important, sort of frazzled my computer. I don't know why it frazzled my computer, but it's totally fine. We'll totally make it work. Replace. So cool. So here's the thing that I can read, and then hopefully you guys won't get too distracted by that. Okay. So the film starts with a quick sound, but I'm not sure what to do here, Shrikant. I'm having like a mini panic attack just because.
Okay, don't worry about it. Aiden, firstly, you're amongst friends, so you can this is not a problem. What are you trying to do?
I just want to be able to see both things and feel competent,
Sure.
which I'm already failing at.
Okay.
So this is cool.
Yeah,
I've got it here. This is cool. This is
perfect.
Fine.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And
so,
see, Aiden, the way in which this works is that our human perception, the visual perception, is very powerful. So once you show the film, show the screen for like a minute or two, you can go and shift to the other one. It's not a big deal, and especially if it is showing like this is perfect. Okay, so
I appreciate that. Okay, cool. So it's about Craig Foster. So basically, he was a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and he reached a point in his life that things were just a challenge, and he uses this film to go into where this challenge is coming from, right? And okay, let me just regroup for a second, because I'm just deciding. My anxiety, I just want to decide how to approach this with my technology, and also so that I can do a little bit of storytelling. Who's seen the film? Have people seen the film in general? Okay, awesome. Such a beautiful story. I had a quick exchange with him because of doing this project, and I'm hoping to turn this presentation into a larger presentation, which would be very exciting. But the film starts with a quote. That's where I'm going to start. Okay, so the film starts with a quick sound bite. He's talking about the octopus, and he says the following: "A lot of people say an octopus is like an alien, but the strange thing is, as you get closer to them, you realize that we're very similar in a lot of ways. You're stepping into this completely different world. It's such an incredible feeling, and you feel you're on the brink of something extraordinary, but you realize there's a line that can't be crossed." So that's the beginning of the film, that you realize that an octopus is like an alien, but as you get to know it, there's this commonality, and it's an incredible feeling. And yet there's a barrier, right? There's a line that can't be crossed, and he's talking about his relationship to the animal world and his own life. We'll get into some of those details. But what I realized in this opening clip, right, in this opening soundbite, is that it fits into Jungian psychology so perfectly, okay? So if we substitute the word octopus for the unconscious, right, and the quote suddenly is about psychology, okay? And I'm going to reread it with that framework, and you'll hear what I mean. So the soundbite would go like this: "A lot of people say the unconscious is like an alien, but the strange thing is, as you get closer to it, you realize that we're very similar in a lot of ways. You're stepping into this completely different world, and it's such an incredible feeling. And you feel you're on the brink of something extraordinary, but you realize there's a line that can't be crossed." And now we're talking about analytical psychology, Jungian psychology. So some of this film and this idea of individuation, Jung's idea of individuation, one facet, right, that was on the themes list is the unconscious versus the conscious. And essentially the premise is we have a conscious personality, and there's a part of our personality that's unconscious, and the two are in relationship to each other. Yeah. So part of the process of individuation is becoming more familiar with the alien parts, becoming more familiar with the nature dimension of the psyche, the deeper layers of ourselves that are quite unconscious originally, right? Or they're quite far away from our conscious attitudes, and finding that place where we can bring that into our life. And of course, the lines where there's lines that can't be crossed, just like he says about the octopus. There's a picture of Carl Jung. For those that don't know, I'm assuming all of us know, he was a Swiss psychiatrist in the 20th century, contemporary of Freud and Adler, who pioneered his own perspective of self-realization, right? This idea of individuation that we're talking about today. So this is where Craig grew up. It was a little bungalow above the high water mark, and his memories are completely dominated by the rocky shore, the intertidal ocean, the kelp forest, and they had a tiny bungalow that was above the high water mark, and the storms would come in. It literally looked like this. The storms would come in and fill the bottom of the house, come through the door and fill the bottom of the house. So it was incredibly exciting for him as a child, growing up in an environment like this. And he would spend time in the rocky pools, diving into the shallow kelp forest and wading in the pools, which this is an image of one of the pools. As a kid, these were the things he most loved to do. So that's the point I want to make right up front, right? As a kid, those were the things he most loved to do, was go diving in this kelp forest and being in the wading pools. But as an adult, he separated from that. He separated from that until he was in his 30s, I think, or late 30s, early 40s. He had really separated from this dimension of his life. And that was until he went to Africa and met the hunters of the Kalahari. And he worked on a film with this documentary film with his brother called The Great Dance. And he met these hunters, the Kalahari, probably some of the best trackers in the world, he says. And to watch to watch them see incredibly subtle signs in nature, things that his eyes couldn't see, and then be able to follow those subtle signs, sometimes for hours, and find the hidden animals in the landscape, it was extraordinary for him to witness this. And he had this sense that they were inside of the natural world, and he could feel that he was outside. So meeting the Kalahari, remember, like these things he loved to do as a child, it had gone away, right? It had gone underground, so to speak. But meeting the Kalahari, it was like this awakening feeling of they were inside of the natural world and he was outside, and he had a deep longing to be inside of that world, inside of that natural order. What happened is, in Craig's life, he reached a certain point that he was stuck. The way he describes it is 2 years of absolute hell. He had been working hard for a long time, and he wore himself out. He wasn't sleeping. His family was suffering. He was getting sick, and his mind couldn't deal with all that stuff. And his overarching feeling was that he didn't want to see a camera or an edit suite ever again. That was his career, right, as a documentary filmmaker. He didn't want to see a camera or an edit suite ever again. He just couldn't face it. He had the sense that his great purpose in life was in pieces. And he has a young child at this point who he felt he couldn't be a father to. And he just knew he had to have a radical change. So he took inspiration from his childhood, and he took inspiration from the master trackers of the Kalahari. And he did the only thing he knew how to do at that moment in time where things were falling apart, which is to go into the ocean. And that's what he does. So you can hear a shift here, right, in the movie. When you watch the film, you get the sense that his life's not working. The life as he's been living it is just not working anymore. His work is wearing him down. He's getting sick, and he knows he needs a radical change. So this is the context in which he goes into the ocean, and I'm going to tie that quickly into this Jungian idea of what we call a midlife crisis, essentially. This idea that the old life doesn't work and we need something to change drastically or radically. From the Jungian framework, life kind of is loosely divided into two halves. You have a first half of life, and then you have a second half of life. And the tasks of each half of life are quite different, according to Jung. The task of the first half of life is primarily about adaptation to the outer world. Adaptation to the outer world. So we establish ourselves in the world via an identity, a career, a family, and we sort of expand our reach in the world. And it's a hard-won achievement, Jung would say, but to adapt to the expectations and pressures of the time and place that we live. But the achievements are won by what Jung calls a diminution of personality, a constriction of personality. So as we adapt to the world and sort of take on identities, take on jobs, take on roles, there's an epic achievement about that. It's the appropriate thing in the first half of life, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is we constrict our personality, we leave things behind. And ultimately, from the Jungian framework, it's the pressure of these parts that we don't develop and we leave behind. It's the pressure from those parts that create what we call the midlife crisis. That's sort of what precipitates it. In fact, here's a direct quote from Jung that expresses this quite well from his essay, Stages of Life. He says, "We wholly overlook the essential fact that achievements which society rewards are won at the cost of a diminution of personality. Many, and this is the important part, many, far too many aspects of life which should also have been experienced lie in the lumber room among dusty memories. Sometimes even they are glowing coals under gray ashes." So it's funny, actually, my friend George, who's here, recommended listening to This Jungian Life's podcast on the midlife crisis. And I had pulled this before I listened to that, but they used the same quote as an example of a midlife crisis text, right? It's this idea that things have been left behind, far too many aspects of life that are like, they're like lumber room, they are left like something in the lumber room among dusty memories or glowing coals under gray ashes. And it's just so perfect in this, I'll go back to the pensive picture because I like this, but it's so perfect for this story because Craig literally expresses this sentiment, right? There's in an interview with Time magazine, he said he felt like he had lost his connection to the world around him and to his family, such a sort of precipitation of a midlife crisis. And there was a deep sense that immersion in nature was what was missing, just what he had seen in the hunters of the Kalahari. And he became aware that he desperately wanted that feeling and wondered how he could have it. Could he learn to read tracks like them? Could he predict animal behavior? These were the questions that he was asking when he went back into the ocean. And I love that where he went was to his childhood loves. That's where he went, the things that he used to love to do, which is to be in the water. And he followed that profound voice. So what's very exciting to me about this is we all kind of have this possibility, right? We all have this invitation. When things are kind of slowing down for us, when things aren't working anymore, we find ourselves profoundly stuck and our habitual way of doing things aren't working. We can always look at what was alive in us as children that we've left behind. That's what we can always ask ourselves. And automatically, Craig Foster does that in this film by going into the ocean here. It's crazy to see too. I mean, I don't know how well you can see this visual, but the place where he was swimming, it's no joke. I mean, it's one of the more dangerous places to swim, two oceans coming together. And you see some clips of him going out and he's getting rocketed back and forth and close to rocks. And you get a sense of, he's this very calm demeanor guy, but this is a serious activity that he's doing going in the ocean like this. It's actually it's not safe ultimately. But he had the sense that he was flying, you know, once he got into the water. You might as well be on another planet, he said. And instinctively, he knew not to wear a wetsuit because he didn't want a barrier between himself and the environment. And in a short amount of time, I think this is an incredible point. You know, from a place of never wanting to touch a camera or be in an edit suite again, when he's back in the ocean, suddenly he realized he has the energy to take pictures again, to take film again. And he picked up his camera and started to do the thing I love and the thing I know. And he picked his camera back up. So what I love in this moment is we have Craig on land who can't move forwards. He can't touch a camera or be on an edit suite. There's no energy there. But when he goes underwater and he goes on this adventure and he follows his childhood love that we touched on, something happens. Energy comes back. And it's particularly pronounced for me because in Jungian, from the Jungian framework, water is such a symbol of the unconscious. In dreams and stories, water usually represents something that has to do with the unconscious. So here he is going underwater and finding this sort of life. I just love that. It's sort of like I know that I'm reading into that, but it sort of excites me, that layer of symbolism. And by doing that, we kind of have this merging of old Craig with new Craig, right? Old Craig as the filmmaker with the camera and his ability to make films, and new Craig as the explorer of this frontier in his own life, following his childhood love. As he follows this passion, the energy folds back into his skill set as a filmmaker, but in a new way. So he found a way to marry, in his own words, the thing I love and the thing I know. So what a powerful step forwards, right? In our life, to take that as a message, the thing that we love and the thing that we know, to integrate them and bring it into our modern life. And in this process, he didn't know that he was going to meet an octopus when he just follows this path. He's just taking pictures of underwater life and being in that cold water. But he meets this octopus, which becomes sort of the other character of the film. And the way he first describes her is, it's a hard thing to explain, but sometimes you just get a feeling and you know there's something to this creature that's very unusual. There's something to learn here. That was his first impression. There's something special about her. And then I had this crazy idea, what happens if I just went in every day? And what happens if I never missed a day? And that's what he does. That's where this film gets made. And when he first started, right, his impression of the underwater is kind of like what we see in this image, which is kind of, we don't know what it is. That was his experience too. It all kind of looked like the same thing. But after a while, he got to know the different types of the forest, the algae forest, the old growth forest, the misty forest. So he's starting to discern the landscape of the water, right? To discern the landscape of this new territory. And he starts mapping the territory and getting a sense of what's going on in this landscape. And he just gets obsessed with this octopus. And something happens, right? So when they meet, they finally make contact. And you got to see the film to see how it unrolls. It's kind of this slow development of trust between him and this octopus. But he has this sense that when something happens when they make contact, here's an image of it. There's some sort of a shift in the trust, and there's some sort of a shift in him. And he becomes essentially obsessed with understanding her and building a relationship with her, and literally going every day and spending time with her. That's kind of the storyline of the film. And at first, it's sort of a cautious distance, and they start to get close, and he spooks her. This is early on in the film. He spooks her once they start to get close, and she runs away. And he spends the next week just trying to find her, sort of in a depressed state, but a very focused state, living and breathing this experience of having begun to earn this animal's trust, which you can kind of see where they're starting to get to know each other and then even in contact. And now she disappears. And with this very focused state, he does everything he can to track her. So he uses the skills of the Kalahari, like this idea of the tracking of the animals, that to see the things that he can't see. And he uses that skill set to attempt to find her. And it takes a week, and it's very rigorous. I'll have to find there's some really cool pictures of it where he makes a map of the whole ocean, and he's collecting all of these different clues. It's literally like, oh gosh, what's it? Sherlock Holmes. He becomes a Sherlock Holmes to find this octopus. And this is kind of a funny tangent, but I think it's relevant to individuation, which is the typology of it. You know, that Jung came up with the roots of Myers-Briggs, and we've done some talks on that, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. What I think is interesting is that in this process of finding the octopus, what you notice is he's using a lot of intuition, and he's using a lot of sensation function, like he's following his intuition and his hunches, many cases in the film, to find her when she's lost. And he uses the sensation function, collecting all of these clues, collecting all these facts, cataloging them back in his home. And I would guess, of course, this is really a guess, I would guess he's an ISTP, but the important thing about that is that I would guess he is a introverted thinking type, which is the same as Jung. That's my very strong guess. And so it's kind of a fun parallel, like Craig's story of individuation with Jung's story of individuation, where Jung went back to his childhood and played with stones and built these sort of stone cities. And that was the beginning of his encounter with his sort of soul. And here we have Craig encountering his soul. And it's an interesting parallel because I think they're both introverted thinking types. But why I say that is, you can see this little X, you can see this graph. Always the thing that's going to be what we need to most incorporate in the process of individuation or most learn to relate to is our inferior function, the one that's least developed. So somebody who's an introverted thinking type, their feeling and their extroverted expression of feeling is going to be the least developed, right? Introverted thinking, opposite of extroverted feeling. You can just look at the line and you see where the opposite is. And on the way to thinking to feeling, you don't just jump from one to the other. You'd have to develop both sensation and intuition, getting into the feeling. So in this story of finding the octopus a second time, you see he's using sensation, you see he's using function, intuition. And I just find that fascinating because you really see his relationship with the octopus developing over time as an external relationship, as a feeling function relationship, as a part of this whole process. And he says, even here, so the animal has spent millions of years learning to be impossible to find. And I had to learn what octopus tracks look like, and it was very frustrating and difficult to discern, to separate the octopus tracks from other tracks. I had to learn everything and start to think like an octopus. He's starting to think like what it is to be the octopus. It's like being a detective and you slowly get all of your clues together, just like Sherlock Holmes. Finally, after looking for a week, there she was. And here's an image of her when they find each other again. So at this point in time, their relationship gets good. It's pretty strong. They're hanging out. She trusts him. She's playing with him. She's holding on to him. And he gets from this place of, remember at the beginning of the film, it's like he feels completely disconnected from his family, and he feels disconnected from nature. And suddenly here he is forming a relationship with this very nature-driven animal. And he starts to question, what is she getting out of it, right? Why would a wild animal be forging this relationship with a human, right? And it gets very interesting, when you have that connection with an animal and have these experiences, it's absolutely mind-blowing, he says. There's no greater feeling on earth. And the boundaries between her and I began to dissolve, just the pure magnificence of her. There is an image that I put on here again with the technology. It may not show, but there's an image where she's holding on to him on his chest, and it's very incredible. But he has this sense that the boundaries are dissolving. Remember the sense of, there's a line you can't cross, and at first it seems like an alien. And suddenly here he is, and he has this sense that the boundaries begin to dissolve. And there's no greater feeling on earth, just the pure magnificence of her. Over the film, this exploration is uncovering all kinds of things literally about science. But I think what's interesting is you start to see he's also uncovering things about himself. His relationships and his waking and his life away from the ocean begin to change. And that's going to be talked about also towards the end. But in other words, like what he's learning about science is the external version, but there's an internal corollary, and that's the point I want to make in terms of individuation. It's almost like, this is just a random quote, but it kind of relates. It's this idea of to go back into a childlike state of wonder. In Jungian terminology, that's creative activity. That's a creative activity. So Craig's going in and staying connected to this underwater world and creating a relationship with this octopus is a creative activity for him. And it's where all the answers to the unanswerable questions come. It's where what he's saying is that the inner and outer worlds are joined in a living union. So that's a little bit lofty, but it's this idea that this outer world of the relationship to the ocean and the octopus is doing something internally. It's changing his sense of himself, and it's changing his relationship to his family, as he talks about in the film. Something happens where the octopus loses a leg to a shark. That's the big predator of the octopus, where he is. And to make this point of the inner and outer being collective, being related, he says the following. Oh, sorry, I should make it clear that the shark does wind up taking off one of the tentacles of the octopus. And Craig's feeling about this was, psychologically, it was like what was happening to her was happening to him. That was his experience. What was happening to her had happened to him in some strange way. He almost felt psychologically like he was going through a dismembering, like she was. He started to think about his own death and his own vulnerability and worrying about his family and his child in a new way. The octopus's vulnerability changed his perspective of his own family and his own life. I hadn't been a person who had felt overly sentimental towards animals before, he said. I realized I was changing. She was teaching me to become sensitized to the other. My God, I love those words. We'll come back to that. Especially wild creatures. Okay? So she was teaching me to become sensitized to the other, especially wild creatures. And in this idea of inner and outer being related, you could say, there is an other out there in the world. The individuation process is to realize when we relate to others, we're really relating to others, actually other people in the world. But there's an inner corollary of that, the other in us, the other in us. And being able to have a relationship to the other in us is related to having a relationship to the other in the world. It's a much longer topic, but there's a corollary to the other. And she was teaching him about that, to be sensitized to the other, especially wild creatures. And, he has this feeling of what to do at this point in time, because he now has become sensitized to this new dimension of nature, right? And in that process, he's become sentimental towards an animal where formerly he was not that sentimental of a person. And as a thinking type, right, he wrestles with this problem at this point in the film. Should he help take care of her? Should he help take care of her? Because he's worried about her deeply, but he also has the sense he's crossing a line when you interfere with the lives of animals. So we hear his habitual orientation towards the world. Don't interfere with nature. Things unfold the way they're supposed to. Don't get involved to a certain degree, like especially with the natural environment. But he's now become too attached to her, and he lets go of his old way of doing things. He lets go of it. And he helps by feeding her. Ultimately, he starts cutting these oysters and giving them to her while she's sick in her den. So you hear a shift. She's really changing him, both outer in his relationships with real people and internally, to do things differently than before. Formerly, he would have let things go. Now he's too attached, and the right thing to do is to try to help. He goes against his own ruling principle based on his relationship. And the most amazing thing starts happening for him. She grows a tiny arm, which I guess I don't have that slide. She grows a little tiny arm, and you can see it. And the tiny little miniature arm looks like the other arms you can see on the slide, but it's like a smaller version. And it gave him a strange sense of confidence that she can get past this incredible difficulty. So he felt in his life, he was getting past his difficulties. And this is an important part of the inner and outer. In this strange way, our lives were mirroring each other. My relationships with people, with humans, was changing. And I guess I already said that, but it's literally mirrored in her body what he's having as an inner experience. It's amazing to think that he says that this animal is capable of that, that can withstand such an attack and fully recover. And he's relating this to his own difficulties. And then this slide is her getting back to her normal activities. As she gets back to her normal activities, he starts to see a whole new way of going deeper into her world. And there's a long stretch of the film where it's like, okay, first she's been spooked and then he won her back. Then she got attacked, now she's healed. It's like these several layers to getting into this, this now point of the film where he goes even deeper. And he's learning about her playful energy with the fish and her capacity to avoid the sharks. And the way he describes it, she was teaching me so much. You just can't wait to get up in the morning. There's so much to understand every day. It's like, remember the lack of energy he has at the beginning of the film? Now he can't wake up to get every day. That's how much energy she gives him. And there's so much to understand, so much behavior, so many species, what they're doing, how they're interacting. It's like as if this new field of interaction is awakening in him. And through relationship with her, that gets awakened. I guess I have to come over to this thing. So I'm going to show an image here that's really cool. This is one image when he goes back into the water and talks about his new relationships, the interactivity of the ocean, right? It's sort of like as his relationships on Earth with his, not on Earth, like his relationships with his family on land are starting to change. You see that he has this new perspective of the whole system within the kelp forest where he is. And he describes it this way. It's almost like the forest mind, this image. You could really feel it. The big creature that was 1,000 times more awake and intelligent than I am. It's like a giant underwater brain operating over millions of years, and it just keeps everything in balance, right, with the typology thing too. It's a self, in Jungian terms, we call it a self-image, but he's getting in touch with the whole system that's operating in this kelp forest. He talks about the 1,000 threads that are between the octopus and the other animals and every species that's existing in this kelp forest. He starts to see these threads, and there's a sense of oneness. And the sense of this million-year-old brain. It's amazing the way he puts it, and the way it restores balance. So let's go back to inner and outer for a second. When we talk about this level of systematic organization and in terms of balance, he's using that nature expression of the kelp forest. But there is an inner corollary of that. And in Jungian terms, we call it the self. It's the place where in our own life, the self-regulating psyche would be Jung's way of putting it, but we regulate ourselves to go into a balance, to ultimately move towards wholeness, to move towards self-realization and full expression of ourselves. And so what I get about this film is, and when you watch it again, I almost guarantee you'll see it, especially after this, it's a part of his own process, getting in touch with his own balance. That's where we talk about typology, or the feeling versus thinking, but also with his relationships with his family, but also with his relationships with nature. And it becomes this sort of spiritual experience for him. And he describes it again this way. It's almost like the forest mind. You could really feel it. You see him swimming through and all these organizational things that happen in that space. It's a big creature that's 1,000 times more awake and intelligent than I am. It's like a giant underwater brain operating over millions of years, and it just keeps everything in balance. My hypothesis is there's an inner corollary of that. There's an inner corollary of that, and then in Jungian terms, we call that the self. And at the end, basically, the octopus recovers from the damage. he's recovering too in the same time. He's got a new relationship, and what happens in her world, he's got a new relationship to nature and himself and energy. And she has baby octopi. I don't know what you call that actually, but she winds up having babies. And I wonder if I can get to that image. Maybe not. It's okay. Oh yeah, here we go. That's one of them. It's crazy how they're born. The octopus have like hundreds of thousands of babies, and only a few of them survive. But him and his son find one of these babies. So the octopus has the babies, and is so they put so much energy into it. She passes away. It's very sad. I'm not dwelling on that part of the story, but there's a new life that comes with this sort of the death of the old. That's the emphasis. It's a new life that's born out of this octopus experience. And it's the new life that he spends with reconnecting specifically to his family, which I guess I'll have to, oh yeah. Suddenly his relationship with his son, which was just this point of pain at the beginning, has changed. There's a new life in that relationship. In fact, he's the one that goes swimming and finds the baby octopus. The child is the one that goes and finds the baby octopus after the mother has died. And you hear this shift. You hear the shift. You know, I'll read a couple of quotes just from the end. I often go to the place of her main den and float above it and feel her there. And he's emotional when he talks about this. And I miss her. And that's from somebody who used to not be sentimental towards animals. You know, his feeling is one of the most exciting things in my life, taking my son, who's here, walking along the shore and just showing him the wonders of nature and the details and the intricacies. I was getting so much from the wild that I could now give. I had so much energy to give back. So, can you hear me still? Shrikant, can you hear me? Okay. And what the story is really talking about is that his relationship changed, right? You start to slowly care about the animals, that everyone is important, how vulnerable they are, and how vulnerable we are. There's the correlation, right? How vulnerable they are, how vulnerable we are, and all the lives on the planet was his new attitude. My relationship with the sea forest and its creatures deepens each day, each week. And he learns the language of this space. And the film ends with this. I fell in love with her, but also with that amazing wildness she represented and how that changed me. What she taught me was to feel that you're part of this place, not just a visitor. And that's a huge difference. He's connected. At the end of the film, he's connected, right? He's a part of the thing. He's not just a visitor. And where at the beginning of the film, he didn't know what he was. He'd lost something. So my sort of ending point here is going to be that we all have this invitation. We all have this invitation. What's the thing we left behind? And this is particularly for people when they feel really stuck. What's the thing we left behind that we used to love? And if we follow that love again, where can it lead us? In this movie, when he does that, it changes his life. It literally changes his life. It's a spiritual experience. And what I love, oh, I can go back to the slides here, is he still dives, but he doesn't dive alone anymore, right? He still dives every day, but not alone. He founded a project with a community of divers, and he goes. So where the story began, there's a great quote in Joseph Campbell in Hero with a Thousand Faces where he says, you know, we kind of go into this individual journey. Our entry point is the dark forest, and we think we're alone, and we think we're against the world, but we find at the end we're with everyone. We're with the whole world. And Craig lived that out. He went into this experience alone and discovered that he is a part of this thing. So I hope that offers all of you here some inspiration to look back at where your love has been in the past, and how you might open the door some more to that and to see where it might lead you. So thanks, y'all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Aiden. So folks, so what we're going to do next is to do breakout rooms. Give me just a second. So we're going to run the breakout rooms for 20 minutes, where we talk about all the ideas that Aiden has presented. And amongst ourselves, I'm going to give there are rules that we have for the breakout rooms to ensure that we get the most out of the breakout rooms. I'm posting the rules in the chat momentarily there. All right, so what we do is that let everybody talk about their takeaways and questions that they want to put on the table first. Just go around, everybody, and then keep on topic, be brief, be courteous. And if you need help, just go ahead and click on ask for help and I'll help you. All right, starting the breakout rooms now. And then comes the main part where everybody comes back and then you can go ahead and talk about your takeaways, put any questions for Aiden on the table. Starting the breakout rooms now. Right, folks, so give me just a second. All right, so now it's time for takeaways and questions. So you can either talk about just your takeaway from the meetup and discussions, or you can put a question down for Aiden, or you can do both. We've got 4 rules. Rule number 1, type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to speak. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. Barry, you're first. Go ahead.
Oh, it's muted, Barry.
Barry, you need to unmute yourself.
I need to unmute myself. I get too excited and I forget to. So I wrote a poem especially for, and this painting behind me fits kind of Valentine's Day and what he's talking about, and it's called Life's Spiral Flow Path, and it's really my path to individuation. I looked at my past and did the math. My life's growth was not a linear path. It's the spiral flow path of a polymath. I no longer climb the path of a monomath, or I'll end up in the same place as before. I got smart one day and turned a corner. I let go of the life I could not control. That's when my life spiral path began to flow. I left behind people and places that didn't grow. I spiraled up doing what I love, learning to climb to the light above. I let my light shine bright. I meditate with all my might. Practice love and being kind. Positivity has changed my mind. Live my life God's way. He gave me the joy every day. Brings peace to my heart as I learn to think smart. I look down from my spiral stair, keep patterns I want to share, disintegrate habits that go nowhere. This energizes me to shine. As I leave my immaturity behind, I grow through the flow to the top, make my life flow nonstop.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Barry. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David, Kevin, Jyoti, Judith, and Madeleine. David.
Hi. I'm trying to think which hero's journey I more admired, Craig Foster's or Aiden's during the talk. I think he did a fantastic job.
Thanks, brother.
I think our room, we were very intrigued because that movie was such a classic. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, Carl Jung, individuation, transformation narrative. Like, could it be possible, like in the editing, or like they had no knowledge of it? Because it was so amazing going into the unconscious waters and encountering, the psychopompous character. I mean, it was just classic Jungian theory. And whether he knew it or not, Aiden, bring this to our attention and how you took us through it. I mean, I haven't fully processed this movie. I saw it a couple of weeks ago. I get very uneasy when I see that octopus because I know what's going to happen at the end. And it really bothers me. I feel such a connection to that animal. It's very, very powerful. And the way you laid it out, Aiden, how this is an individuation story. It's been a long time since I've just sat with a movie and just said to myself, I haven't processed this yet. It's going to take time. So I just really want to thank you for this talk.
Thanks, David. And just for everybody that's here, fun note, David will be leading the group in 2 weeks on the 28th, I believe, on von Franz. Do you want to talk about it now or talk about it at the end? What makes sense for you, Con?
This is a good time to talk about it. David, can you tell us about what you'd be doing 2 weeks from now?
Well, von Franz wrote a fairy tale about octopi. No, I'm kidding. But
what if just every meeting after this was just about octopi? That'd be
right. And my wife won't let me eat calamari. So, we're talking about my talk. So, well, you guys asked for it. I really, really went into my pile of von Franz books, and I found some really amazing insights that have altered my life completely. And I've put it together in sort of a treasure hunt kind of story. And it's geared for people who never really heard of von Franz at all. So feel free to invite family or friends, but I think you're really going to enjoy it. I think we're going to really go very deep in this story. So buckle up.
Can you speak for 1 minute on who von Franz is? Because few of folks here may not know who she is.
So Marie-Louise von Franz is considered Carl Jung's greatest disciple. She was introduced to him when she was only 18 years old. And her volume of work, especially about fairy tales, is jaw-dropping. It's amazing. Where Dr. Jung, he's a tough read. Von Franz is like a fine wine. It's amazing, her flow and what she come up with. And I just don't think of psychology without thinking of her as an equal to Jung. So I'm happy to introduce people to just the influence she had on this field.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. Next up is going to be Kevin, Jyoti, Judith, and Madeleine. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Aiden. Nice story. I'm going to watch the movie later after the show.
Kevin, you need to speak a little louder. We can barely hear you.
Okay. Yeah, octopus has 8 legs. We only got 2. So explore our world, use a different direction. Individual as general, self-other relationship, interpersonal, personal within nature. It's how amazing we all connected. My question for Aiden, how do you understand this? Everything matters. Everything is connected. Thank you.
I love that. Was there a question towards the end? Was it a question or was it sharing at the end?
Yeah, what's your thought? What's your thought like based your story? Like, for me, I can pose something like our personal genetic, we 99.9% the same, but we normally talk about the difference, individual, and here's then from the big one, we talk about the cosmos theory. Actually, the natural science, other theory, back the same. If our back based on subjective, most subject from philosophy, is split to the math, physics. Why don't we put them together again? Thank you. I talk too much here.
Thanks. No, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer to that, Kevin, necessarily, or a comprehensive one, but my quick answer is very in alignment with Jungian psychology, which I think this is one of the many things that made Jung such an interesting figure, is that he really paid attention to people's lenses, right? People's perspectives, people's sort of habitual way of being. So like when because he was a contemporary of Freud and Adler, two other psychiatrists at his time, and Freud looked at the unconscious and reduced it to sort of this psychosexual world. And Adler looked at the unconscious and said, kind of thematically focused the material around power and teleological urges, arrangements, and things like this. So here's a situation where two people are theoretically looking at the same material and seeing different things, emphasizing different things, de-emphasizing different things, omitting things. So when we get into a comprehensive type of system, we can always ask the question, what is the person's personality through whom this system is being looked at? It's kind of a strange way of putting it, but in other words, if I look at the system and I don't think about what I'm emphasizing and de-emphasizing and omitting, I'm kind of missing something very important. And Jung really brings that to the table. So that's my quick thought about that.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing. We did a whole meetup on the consciousness of octopus, because octopus is actually very interesting consciousness, because the brain of the octopus is a distributed brain. So it's not just that it has 8 legs, it has 8 brains. It has, each of those tentacles has its own nervous part of the nervous system, which is almost which operates on its own to some extent. So it's like, it's a distributed kind of consciousness. So it's really, really fascinating. Next up is going to be Jyoti, Judith, Madeleine, and Bowden. Jyoti.
Yeah, hi, Aiden, Philadelphian.
Hi.
Yeah, your presentation was quite profound. That was very good. And I think from time to time, we all go through a period of disconnection. And it goes back for me 9 years ago. I gave another story to my breakout room, but I'm going to give you another story, and I'm going to make it very quick. I went through a major upheaval in my life, and all those, amidst everything else, we moved here in the city where I live. And it's a beautiful place. It's overseeing the water. There's a bridge over there. There is a reflection of the lights in the night, but I was very disconnected. I was not seeing all that because I was consumed in this world that I was placed in without my permission. So what happened was, like what this author, he went back to, this producer, Craig, what's his last name? I forget already. He went to Foster. He went to the times when he used to be in the water. So he wanted to, that was his best time of his life. So he wanted to work on that and bring whatever he could bring in himself, so that he could feel connected with his family, with the world, and what have you. And the same thing happened with me. I started to walk around the Penn's Landing, the water side, and I started to first go back in the times when I traveled, and then I went back to my childhood, which was full of fun and everything. And that started to slowly bring me connected to my, the autopilot that I was on, split that, and feel connected to the world that I was living in. And I started to enjoy what other people were saying. Look, what a place you are living in. And so I think there is some merit to that you have to go back in your life and search the good parts of your life to bring up in the present, to connect yourself with that. And that's what I wanted to say. I can go on and on about that, but I think it's also nostalgia, and that everything's when put together for you, you feel like a newer person. Thank you.
Thanks, Jyoti. One thought I have about that, thank you for sharing that. And I love your personal, relating to this story. And one thing I just would quickly add is I was just reading in Jung the other day. So it fits in perfectly. A new passage I'd not seen from him before, I think in the collected work 7, 2 essays on analytical psychology, but he's talking about how sometimes when things fall apart, if it's not a matter of our life really falling apart, like psychotic, or really, there's this in analytical psychology, there's a viewpoint. Sometimes things fall apart, kind of almost for a future purpose. It's not like on purpose. Like in other words, it's not causal. Like this happens so you can have a different life. But you kind of say sometimes the the things fall apart. And when you kind of weed your way through that, it leads to a more meaningful life. It leads to something that's more balanced. And that's quite an interesting way, right? A midlife crisis can seem like a real problem, or things can be really negative. But the idea that something very meaningful can come out of it on the other end, that's quite an interesting idea to me. And I think your story speaks to that, and Craig's story and Jung's life speaks to that as well. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Judith, Madeleine, Bowden, and Kim. Judith.
Yeah, thank you. So I watched this film several months ago. So when it first came out, probably 3 months ago, anyway. So I want to watch it again. And this, by the way, is before I knew about Jung and everything. Very ignorant person here, but before I knew all these things that we've been discussing for a long time in the meetup groups, different ones of Sri Kant's. So my impressions weren't colored by any of that. So I found it very interesting because I didn't watch it again since then. And I was so excited because I actually put it on the meetup chat sometimes because it comes up into my mind for other reasons. And I'll say, oh, watch this film, right? My octopus teacher. But so it's interesting to hear how you bring all that Jungian stuff in. And in my meetup group, break room, we talked a lot about midlife crisis and how, looking back into our childhood or times in our lives when we found things interesting. But I initially had a very different response or reaction to the film, which is really a lot more in line with what I heard Kevin saying. And I often feel that we look through a very humanistic lens. We give ourselves this extra weight, but we're just biological creatures, we're just another evolutionary step. So yeah, we can do amazing things, but we seem to analyze everything from that mental space. And I think what I got from the film is that Craig had lost touch with the fact that he is part of nature and that nature has its own wisdoms. And I think we connect with nature with those 5 senses that we touch the world with. But I think that those 5 senses might look inferior to, what we can do with them if we take them and think about them. But some of it goes into our unconscious, and I feel there's just wisdom there that we have lost the ability to tap into. And when we do go either back to those childhood experiences or those first experiences, we'll probably realize a lot of them do have to do with our senses. And that's what drew him back. And that's the connection he saw with the desert, Craig, the filmmaker saw with the desert trackers, that they had that wisdom. They knew so much about their world. Anyway, that's what I got from it. And I just thought I'd bring that up.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you. Let's see. Next up is going to be Madeleine. Anytime you want, Aiden, you can go ahead and comment on anything anybody's saying. Okay. Next up is going to be. Go ahead.
I'll say quickly to Judith. I love. Welcome to the sort of young thing, and I love that you're jumping in. And it's funny. It's like in my mind, I love where you're coming from, and I think you'll find it's very in alignment with a lot of analytical psychology in the sense of what we are missing a connection to, and sometimes it's nature or instinct or various other aspects of our reality that are underdeveloped. But when you spoke, I was like, yeah, she's. It's surprisingly on topic. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you, Aiden. Next up is going to be Madeleine. Madeleine, go ahead.
Yes, hello, thanks. So what I had said in the breakout room, to sum it up, is that in the earlier session today with the Center for Digital Life, we had spent a lot of time talking about in a very heady, philosophically oriented way, talked about the problem of being disembodied from the world and disconnected, and how disconnected our souls become. And I felt like Aiden's session was kind of the antidote to the heady part of the talk and restored the magic. And there's a famous paper by Thomas Nagel called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? It's philosophy of mind. Nagel basically believes we can never truly know the perceptual world of another kind of organism. But what Aiden brought out so wonderfully is that we may not be able to know what it's like to be an octopus, but we can form relationships with other beings and with other species. And how incredible it is that the world comes forward to meet us in these ways, through animals or through events or through objects in our lives, weather, someone had mentioned earlier, that can push us into growth or lead us into growth, or we can use for growth, but on the path to individuation. And then I also thought, I just thought I would throw in at the end, what was it like for the octopus on her life's journey within her octopus umwelt of individuation to have this enormous creature come and instead of being a predator, to be a playmate and someone who she grew to trust? So what was it like for the octopus on her own journey to have her relationship with Craig?
I love that so much. Thanks, Madeleine.
All right. Next up is going to be Bowden, followed by Kim. Bowden.
Yeah, I'm excited about and positive about the positive presentation about individualization. This is very important considering we heard in the last lecture how we're threatened by digital disincarnation and tribalism and all sorts of problems. So this is very important, and it also speaks to existentialism, promoting agency. My question is, how do we reconcile this individualization that everybody is supposed to go through, and it's important to go through it, with a connection with a collective, because we've lost our collective mythologies that we did belong to. And once again, all this is within the framework of the unconscious. There's a personal unconscious and archetypes, and there's collective archetypes that are universal. So how do we reconnect after we disindividuate? There's a reconciliation problem and a tension here.
Yeah. So will you pose the question one more time, Bowden? Just I'm thinking of how to answer it.
It's important to be our own selves, but if everybody's their own selves, how do we connect to come up with some universal project? You know, everybody's rotating in their own universes. That's a real problematic of today's world, condition. And that's actually good to be yourself because of the threats of digital. We heard the threats of digital disincarnation and hyperreality and what's so, you know, all the media. But after being individuated, how do we reconnect with a universal project? Because we've lost the universal project.
Well, I think I understand your question better. So what I can say is I want to make a distinction between individualism and individuation, because Jung makes this distinction. So individualism is the process of emphasizing sort of characteristics that are, it's emphasizing the differences, it's basically purposefully emphasizing how one is different than others. That's individualism. Individuation is the process of self-realization and ultimately becoming whole. That's very important. When I say becoming whole, it's integrating the collective into the life of the individual. So you have a connection to individuation is the solution to the question that you're asking, but individuation is different than individualism. There's an idea that of being consciously related to who I am as an individual and what collective is inside of me. And what I love about Jung psychology is, he doesn't focus too much on groups. He does talk about mass psychology or mob psychology or whatever he calls it, but ultimately his point of view is every group is comprised of individuals. Every group is comprised of individuals. And everybody who is a leader is supported as a leader by the followers and vice versa. So everything is happening in the frame. If there are no individuals, there are no groups. It's not to say the groups are not influential. It's not to say that. But where the change happens is when an individual wakes up, when an individual goes through their process of self-realization, which Jung calls individuation. That's where it happens. Otherwise, it, in my mind, becomes too theoretical. The only thing I can say is, how do I relate to myself and to the collective in me? And of course, with an outer corollary, that's the only thing I can do. I don't have a lot of philosophical solutions to it.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Kim. Kim, go ahead. Kim, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi,
Can
Kim.
you hear me? Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to thank you. I got a lot out of this. I didn't see the film. However, your explanation was awesome. I could totally, I totally relate to. Well, let me begin with this. Being a Black woman in America, I totally could relate to what the octopus must have felt like, being, you know, considered a monster or unapproachable, or, you know, what the unconscionable ideals are in reference to Black people. And yeah, and I'd like to say that what I totally understood was the spiritual sense of finding self by being open to someone else and who they are. Yeah. And the awesome gifts that well, let me speak for myself, that I've discovered just by connecting to people that seemed different than I, and how it opened me up to the degree of being able to heal myself, to be in my own truth, and still be able to connect to the collective on a much greater frequency, a much higher perspective, you know? So it was really empowering to hear this Jungian ideology, and how this person, Craig, was able to find himself.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. I really appreciate that thought and viewpoint. Thanks for sharing.
All right. So, Aiden, I do want to ask you one question, because I do think that, you know, the Jung's concept of self and individuation is really the heart of Jung. Like everything else is just kind of around, because the purpose is to aim at yourself and go through this process of individuation. So can you talk about the process of individuation itself a little bit? What is individuation?
Yeah. So the process of individuation, Jung defines it as sort of simultaneously a goal and a process. I'm getting a lot of texts which are buzzing on my phone, so it's not a good time for that if somebody's texting me in the group. So individuation is both a goal and a process simultaneously, and it's the goal of self-realization or becoming whole, ultimately. And you said, what is it, or what does it look like? What was the question?
What is it?
Yeah,
what is
so
individuation?
it's a good question, and it's hard, right? Because it's sort of an abstract concept, but you know, it's the expression of life through the individual that ideally is what is meant to be expressed. That's kind of a sort of a hard way to put it, but there is a spiritual side of it. And you know, when Jung first discovered individuation, the way that I'll tell you how he discovered it, and maybe this will answer your question. he was working with patients who had a lot of inner pressure in their life, a lot of inner pressure, and it was coming out in dreams, it was coming out in complexes, and these, in terms of relationships and these kinds of things. And so he was working with patients that had this inner pressure, and he felt it. It was showing up in anxiety, it was showing up in complexes. So what Jung came up with is a sort of brilliant, it's like a beginner mind brilliance, almost in a way, this concept of active imagination, which is to express that stuff intentionally, take it out of the realm of automatic. It's automatically going to happen in complexes. It's automatically going to happen in dreams. Take it out of the automatic and express it intentionally. And what he found was these early patients of his, when they would express it, and it was to their own talents that they expressed it, sometimes painting, sometimes drawing, sometimes dancing, sometimes building, for different people, different things. But what he found was when it was expressed intentionally, it depressurized the situation. The anxiety went down, the dreams went down. So it depressurized the whole thing. And it was a pivotal moment for Jung to realize this. So we say individuation is almost like taking the energy that's in us, and rather than just expressing it automatically, how do we express it intentionally? How do we get in tune with that flow and make it this sort of, how do we harness the expression of being us? Maybe that's the best way to put it. How do we harness the expression of being us? That's the individuation process.
Wonderful. Beautifully put. All right, folks. So thank you very much. I want to tell you about amazing meetups coming up next week. Next week, we have got 6 meetups. Next weekend, we've got 6 meetups. Number one, Saturday at 12 p.m., we've got Dr. Rick Lippin, who's going to be talking about the fundamental trends in health and medicine. He's a very big proponent of integrating mind and body. So that's what he's going to be talking about. So that's at 12 p.m. Eastern. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern, Robert Trasinski will be here, and he's a writer, and he's been teaching writing for 20 years. And he's going to be talking about the most complex part of writing, and that is developing your own style. That's the highest level issue with writing. So that's what he's going to be talking about. At 5 p.m., we have something I still can't believe that we're doing this, but one of my favorite thinkers is John Boyd, who is a military strategist who has completely transformed the US military through his ideas of OODA loop, of how do you respond to a fast changing situation, what kind of thinking you need to be doing. And he did not write at all. So most of his ideas were presented as presentations to military. And after he died, his associate of 20 years continued giving presentations to the Marines, to the Navy, and that's the name of his associate is Chuck Spinney. He's going to be here, and he's going to present the same presentation to us. It's an interactive presentation it's called Evolutionary Epistemology. It's how do you think and cope with and thrive in a fast-changing world? What kind of, so don't miss that. It's 5 p.m. It's really, I think, historic. I've just profound respect for those presentations of John Boyd, and we are able to hear that live from Chuck Spinney. It's something just remarkable. At 12 p.m. on Sunday, we are going to be continuing our series with Center for the Study of Digital Life, and we'll be talking about Marshall McLuhan, who is a very deep thinker on media and what it does for us. So what happens when you move from an oral culture to a scribal culture, to a printing culture, to give me just a second, to TV culture, and to a digital culture. So it's all about looking at what these technologies do for us and do to us, and what we should do about them, and how do we maximize our life from that. So that's going to be at 12 p.m. on Sunday, 12 p.m. Eastern. Next, we are going to, at 2:30 p.m., we are going to be looking, some of the top researchers on polymathy are going to be here talking about the nature of polymath. And at 5 p.m., Dr. Brian McQuay is going to be back, and he's going to be talking about Julian Jaynes and his idea of conscious interiority. and how you can use that idea in order to reshape your life, how you can use it as a tool for reshaping your life. So it's just, I can't believe that those 6 meetups of that quality coming up next weekend. So don't miss any of them. And then 2 weeks from now, David Bloom and Aiden will be back to talk about One France. So thank you very much, folks. We'll see you soon. And thanks, Aiden. In spite of all this technical difficulty, I thought you did a fantastic job.
Thank you, Srikant. Thanks for hosting, and thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Aiden. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good to
Thank
see you
you
again.
Bye, everybody.